The Alabama Aquarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the lab, and this morning we are going to talk about otoliths. Otolith translates to ear stone. Oto is ear and lith is stone. And there are a lot of things that we can learn from otoliths. So they are ear stones in fish skulls. So we're going to talk a little bit more about otoliths, and I'll show you some specimens, and we will talk about some of the things that scientists in Alabama are learning from otoliths. So again, otoliths are ear stones. I'm going to move some of this over. I brought some accompanying fossils in case we want to talk about some other fossils. But they are found in the skulls of fish. Can you hear this rattling? Yes. So they are loose. They're not attached to the skulls. So you can hear that rattling. This is from a drum, a black drum, I think, a big black drum. And I've got a smaller black drum here. You hear them rattling around in there. And these are catfish. These are probably the ones you're most likely to find on the beach. So I think one of you was mentioning that you'd found these and heard something shaking around in there. So those are the otoliths. This one has had the skull broken and the otoliths have come out. So if you listen, you don't hear anything rattling in there. So this is where the skull was broken and the otoliths came out. These are all from catfish. So we've got several that still have the otoliths in them. And then this is from a red grouper. And then this one is from a red snapper. So you don't hear that one rattling so much. The otoliths are probably still in there, but they're smaller for the red snapper than for these drum and for these catfish. So we'll talk a little bit about why fish have the otoliths. You guys have any ideas? No. Why fish have otoliths? Those things that the ear stones, we call them ear stones. Nope. And they help the fish orient themselves in the water.
What do they look like?
Well, I'm about to show you some otoliths. So I'll show you several kinds. So if a fish is, so this is the mouth of the fish, and so if a fish is kind of tilted to one side or the other, their otoliths help them understand how they are oriented in the water. Or if they were all the way upside down, or if they were swimming up, it helps them orient themselves, kind of like a sense of balance. And it's kind of typical that fish that live in murkier water, like if it has a lot of sand or sediment, or if they live deeper in the water where there's not as much light, those fish may rely more on that sense of balance than on sight. So if you think about our senses, what different senses do we have?
Feeling.
Feel, yeah.
Feel, smell, taste, hearing.
Mm-hmm. And so we do have that kind of, you might include that in a sense of feeling, but we have that sense of orientation, right? Would you know that if you were lying down or standing up?
Not really.
You couldn't tell if you were lying down or standing up? How about the rest of you? Could you tell? Yeah. Or if you were upside down, like if you were hanging from monkey bars, even if you had your eyes closed and your ears plugged, could you tell? Yeah. We're looking at otoliths, so let's show the otolith of a red snapper. Oops. And you guys are welcome to touch that if you want to. And then this one, this is also an otolith of a red snapper. But one of the things that scientists here do with otoliths, and not just from red snappers, but from other kinds of fish as well, is they can take this otolith out of a fish's skull. So this one is a red snapper skull, and so an otolith like this would come out of a red snapper skull. And they can slice it. Do you guys know what you can tell from slicing a section of tree? So if you sliced a tree, what would you see on the inside of it? Do you know?
Wood.
Wood. Mm-hmm. And so if you cut a tree and you looked at the cut side, what you would see are rings. And you can figure out the age of the tree, because as they grow, they will grow at different rates through different seasons. And so you can tell because it looks different from like spring and summer when they grow more in the winter. So you can actually tell how many years old it is by looking at the difference in the sizes of those tree rings. There are other things that you can tell from looking at tree rings. Well, it's kind of similar with the otoliths. So they can slice them. So you see this one has been sliced, and they can look. You might need a magnifier to see this, and they can use a microscope, but if you guys want to check that out, you can. And can use the magnifiers to look at these. So these are sections from an otolith. You see how this works?
Those are like layers?
Yeah. So they have a little device, a tool they can use to slice these really thin and put them on slides, microscope slides, and then look at them under a microscope. So I'm going to show this to the camera. So this is a sectioned red snapper otolith mounted on microscope slides in order to look at the rings inside the otolith. So if you guys want to check these out with these magnifiers, you can do that. Might be a little easy. You can pick them up if you want to too. Might be a little easier to see them with a microscope, but you guys can probably get the idea. So they can tell how old a fish is by looking at the rings in the otoliths, because as the fish grows, its otolith is growing with it, and they also grow seasonally. So you can see seasonal kind of growth patterns in those otoliths, and
I can see really good.
You can? Oh, good. And so they can take these otoliths, they can tell how old a fish is.
That kind of looks like little lips to me.
It does. And this is valuable information. So they could have a fish that they have caught, and they can measure it and weigh it, and then they can take the otoliths out, and they can figure out how old it is. And so they can combine all that information for a particular fish, and then they can get a lot of samples of a particular species of fish, like a red snapper. And so they can understand, with lots and lots of samples, they can understand kind of the growth, normal growth rate of these fish. There are some other interesting things that you can tell from otoliths. So you could take an otolith, and as those minerals, you guys know where you have minerals in your body? Like your bones are made of what? Do you know?
Mineral.
Yeah, you know what kind? Do you know, has anybody ever told you you had to eat or drink something particular to help strengthen your bones and make your bones grow? Calcium, yeah. So what do you eat or drink that makes your bones, that has calcium? Milk, yeah.
Orange juice?
Well,
That's vitamin C in it.
has vitamin C. That has some vitamins you need. Milk, cheese, those have a lot of calcium in them. Yogurt, yeah, dairy. And so that provides your body with calcium that you need for your body to pull the calcium out of your diet and put it into your bones. So the fish bodies will take minerals and use them to make their otoliths. Well, interestingly, scientists can go out to particular water bodies like Mobile Bay, right here. You can see Mobile Bay from where we're sitting, or the Gulf of Mexico, which is just over on the other side of the island. And they can kind of like analyze the chemical and the minerals that are in those waters, and kind of create like a signature for those water bodies. And they will be different for different areas of water. And so what they could do is they could take these otoliths and they could find a particular ring, say the ring when the fish was first born or first hatched until it was a year old. And they could try to match it with a known chemical signature for a water body. And then they could do it for another ring. So say when the fish is 3 years old. And just as an example, they might be able to tell that that fish hatched in Mobile Bay and it lived in Mobile Bay until it was a year old, and then it moved out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it lived out into in the Gulf of Mexico until it was 3 years old. And then it moved back into Mobile Bay. So those are some of the things that they might be able to tell from these otoliths. So there's a whole lot of information to get about a fish's life, right? How else could you tell that about a fish's life? Where it first hatched, where it lived when it was a baby. So that's that's a lot of you usually you can't follow them around and figure out where they're living, when they're babies. I mean, we have some other kinds of technology that help us get this information, but that's a pretty good tool to help us get that information. So another thing that you can find out from otoliths, this is kind of cool. I told you I was going to tell you about fossils that you can find on the beach. So these are not fossilized, but if these fish die and their hard parts, their bones, their otoliths, sink to the bottom and they get buried, this takes a very long time. It takes, thousands of years up to millions of years, just kind of depending on the environmental conditions for fossilization to happen, right? But these hard parts can get fossilized.
Have you figured out how long these fish have died?
Oh, these fish they died recently. So when I say recent, it could have been a few years ago, but these aren't fossils. So, this was it wasn't thousands to millions of years old. Yeah. So these, are some fish skulls that most of them were collected from a fish market, actually.
What would that look like if these bones have been lying in the ocean for like thousands of
I'm
years?
about to show you. All right, so these are fossilized otoliths. Yeah, so give me a second. I'm going to show folks at home these fossilized otoliths. And then I'll bring them back over here and you can take a closer look. Let's see if I can show. Let's try to show one of the big ones. So these are from different species, and these were collected right on Dauphin Island beaches. So these are between 2 and 5 million years old. They're from a deposit that's about 2 to 5 million years old. Wow. And the reason we are now finding them on Dauphin Island is because, all right, I'll tell you more about those in a second, but I'm going to tell you why we're finding them on Dauphin Island. It's kind of an unusual circumstance. And so this is kind of exciting to paleontologists that they have access to these fossilized otoliths, which they wouldn't ordinarily have. So this is Dauphin Island right here. Okay. And then over here is Fort Morgan Peninsula. So Dauphin Island here, Fort Morgan Peninsula. And there is a ship channel, because this water is, Mobile Bay is only about 10 feet deep on average. And so in order for big ships to get from the Gulf of Mexico, south of Dauphin Island, all the way up to Mobile, The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredges a ship channel to about 50 feet deep so those big boats can come in here because most of Mobile Bay is, you know, shallow. So when they dredge that, they interrupt this kind of natural pattern of sand movement. So usually sand is kind of riding this current from Fort Morgan Peninsula over to Dauphin Island. Okay? There is still sand moving like down Dauphin Island like this. The currents carry it. If you've ever been to the beach and you kind of got pushed away from where you'd set up your beach towel or your beach chair, you might have been riding in that current too, the longshore current. But it pushes sand. So what happens over here on the east end is this sand erodes. It goes this way. And naturally, it would be getting sand from over here, but that sand falls in that 50-foot channel, and then they scoop it up and carry it away. So what that means is that this beach shrinks. And a few years ago, the town of Dauphin Island got some funding to put a lot more sand right here. And so they went, they did a study, a research study to find the best way. They hired a consulting firm to figure out the best way to put sand there, where to get it, where to put it, how to keep it there. And they scooped sand from about 5 miles south of Dauphin Island, and they put it right here. Well, when they went there and they scooped all that sand, they scooped up a bunch of fossils. There were a bunch of fossils that they scooped up. And so then when they put that right here on the east end of Dauphin Island, they put all those fossils there too. And so you can go there and you can find fossils.
And
where are we?
I doubt it. So we are on the east end of Dauphin Island, right here. And so there's an east end beach. And if you go to that beach, you can find these fossils. So let me show. What's that?
And there's Houstonville. His name's Houston.
So we are on the east end of Dauphin Island. The Sea Lab is on the east end of Dauphin Island. This is where that deposit was made. And there's an east end beach access there. And so you can go there and look for fossils. Now you can find fossilized shark teeth. You can find fossilized crab parts. You can find fossilized shells and corals. But we're just talking particularly about the fossilized otoliths.
Would you find them anywhere in the west end?
That sand is, you know, as I mentioned, it kind of naturally moves from east to west. That's kind of the natural pattern of the currents here. So it is actually moving this way, and you can find them, you know, a mile or so down at least. I'm not sure how far they've gotten yet as they're being moved by those currents. But
I was once walking down the beach over here and I found one.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, neat. So most of them are this kind of amber color. I'll spread them out on some of these trays and you guys can take a closer look at them and see if you can see some, you know, some that look the same and some that look different. You guys could try to sort them a little bit and see if you see, you know, 2 or 3 that you think might be from the same kind of fish. So people who really know their otoliths can actually look at these and they can figure out the species of fish based on the otolith. So this is some other information that scientists can get from otoliths. So if you want to, you can look. These are some that have, you know, that this is a guide that will show you what kind of otoliths you're finding. They look similar.
Yeah.
You can kind of make piles if you want to. So some of them are kind of long and skinny like this, and some of them are more round.
Like this one?
But one of the things that I'll point out, let me find a big one because it's easier to see on the really big ones. You got a big one? Okay. So one of the things to look for when you're hunting otoliths is it's going to be convex. If you thought about a bowl, okay, so a bowl would have a convex side. That's the side you would put your cereal in, right? And then I'm sorry, a concave side would be the side you'd put your cereal in. The convex side of the bowl would be the outside, right? And so if you think about a clamshell is kind of similar to that, right? It would have a side you could scoop some water or some sand in, and then the other side, would be the outside. But the otoliths are different. So instead of having a convex side and a concave side like this, they mostly will be shaped like this, where they'll have two convex sides. So that's one of the ways you can kind of tell them from clams, because they do sort of look a little bit like eroded clam shells. So you can see the rounding like that.
Yeah. But
You guys can use these magnifiers as well if you want.
A little bit. Here's one that definitely.
So we have a friend who's a paleontologist at McWane Center in Birmingham, and he has collected with a lot of help. So actually, if you wanted to, you could contribute. You could be citizen scientists, and you could find otoliths, and you could send them to June at McWane, or even take photos and send photos. But he has a 4,000 otolith sample. So he has sampled 4,000 otoliths from the beaches of Dauphin Island.
what's the biggest
From
one
this,
out there?
the biggest one that I have found is about that big. It's pretty big, but that's not the biggest. I'm not sure if you're asking like the biggest that we're finding on the beach or the biggest otoliths that exist. That's a big one,
Do
yeah.
like animals such as whales have them?
No, whales are not fish, but bony fish have them. So there are other kinds of fish too that are not bony fish. Catfish actually have really large otoliths for their size, and in fact, this is the skull of the catfish. So this is like the front side of the catfish. This is the mouth end, and so this is the top of the skull. So mouth end, top of the skull. And I'm going to open this up, and we can pull the otolith out of here, okay, if I can.
Wow,
All right, so I'm just going to break this bone, this part of the skull. It's fragile, brittle. And we can pull that otolith out, and you guys can see how big it is. So this catfish, just to give you an idea of the size of this catfish was probably about this big. This is a hardhead catfish. And if you look at that otolith, that's a pretty big otolith. And the snappers, their otoliths they're not as big, and they have quite a different shape. So compare that catfish otolith to this snapper otolith. They look quite different, don't they?
This one is curved,
Uh-huh.
like a moon.
Uh-huh.
like a crescent.
That one's like concave and that one's like convex.
You're right. So that one is kind of an exception to, what I told you to look for on the beach. But most of the ones that we find on the beach are that was a tip for finding the fossils out on the beach, but it's not true for all otoliths. It's just a way that you can kind of differentiate these otoliths that we're finding from the clams, because there are a lot of clam shells out there, and they can be easy to confuse. So let me borrow that one real quick. I'll give it right back to you, but I'll show folks at home the difference between the snapper otolith and the catfish otolith. Here you go.
Is it kind of hard to open those big ones?
It can be, yeah. Some of these have, pretty thick. You can feel that if you want to, how thick. This is the cavity where those otoliths float.
That's not that hard. Why is it all brown
Pretty thick.
like that? In the inside.
You want to smell it? Most of the flesh is gone from it, but if you see some of these skulls,
Does it still
they've
got flesh on it?
they've kind of, I mean, not, I wouldn't say flesh necessarily, but it may still have some, yeah, that's not, it hasn't been stripped of all of the, you know, of
Does it
everything
still
except
have,
the
like,
mineral.
bacteria in it?
It's possible. Most everything has
Wanna say it
bacteria
does.
on it, right? And in it, including you. You got quite a population of bacteria in it. Much of it is helpful to you.
And this has a tiny hook on it.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good
Yeah,
observation.
but you don't want to.
So, I asked my friend who just published a study. I asked him for an update on how many species they have identified now among their 4,000 otolith sample, and including some fish that they have. Mostly, they've identified them by the otoliths. But they've also identified a few species of shark from fossilized shark teeth and a few species of fish by the teeth. But we're talking just like a handful compared to the number that they've identified with the otoliths. And I think he said 55, between 52 and 55. He just texted me, and I would check, refer back to it. But
I thought a part of the bed
But I'm
from there.
Yeah.
using my camera to film. You found a piece of bone?
Yeah.
So, you know, he's using that information to kind of make a list of the fish species that are present in Alabama's fossil record. So, you know, that is these are like data points for a fossil record. So my kids like to find these otoliths and send them
You find
to.
them a lot? Like when they're
Yeah,
out there?
yeah,
That's crazy.
So it does take a little while to kind of get an eye for them, but once you do, you start seeing them in the sand.
So,
And
so
so
would you have a chance of finding the otolith by itself, or more of a chance of finding it in a fossil?
no, usually when you're finding the fossilized otoliths, you're more likely to find the otolith by itself. Excuse me.
So can they, because I know you said there was like a chemical signature, can they detect like what the environment was like millions of years ago by looking at? Like,
I am not sure about how much they might glean from.
like what exactly was in the water? or
Right,
whatever?
yeah. So with fossilization, I mean, they may be able to tell something, but it may not, it's not necessarily going to be the same as what they can tell with the ones that are recent, the ones that are from today.
Yeah.
Because with fossilization, the mineral is replaced as it fossilizes.
Okay.
They may be able to tell something about the environment by the shape of the otoliths themselves and by the, like a
Way that
comparison with a lot of these species are still living today and still found today. Actually, most of them are. So they could tell, for example, that a lot of these the otoliths are big for the size of the fish. And so, you know, they might be able to interpret from that it might have been, like an estuary system like Mobile Bay, because we have a lot of rivers that flow into Mobile Bay. This is the watershed of Mobile Bay. That's the area of land that drains to a particular body of water. So if you see here, Mobile Bay's watershed covers most of Alabama, part of Mississippi, part of Georgia, and a little bit of Tennessee. Excuse me. So there's a lot of river and stream inflow into Mobile Bay, and it pushes a lot of sediment with it, and sometimes also like tannins, which are it's kind of like tea that's made with leaves that sit in a swamp, like up in the Mobile Delta. So sometimes we get tannins in our water, but the water it doesn't have a whole lot of clarity because there's so much in our water, so much stirred into the water. And so the visibility is not great. It has a lot of nutrients, so this is a very we have a lot of diversity out here, a lot of different kinds of animals, but the visibility is not great in the water. So may not be the best place to snorkel as far as being able to see. But there are a lot of different kinds of animals there. But, you know, we know kind of the species that we find in the estuary system today, and we may be able to interpret, you know, that these were in a system like that.
Yeah.
It looks like there's 2 in this one.
You think?
Yeah.
Oh, there are. Yeah, that's right. So there's one on each
You can have more
side.
than one?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So each fish would have one on each side of its skull. So 2 otoliths, a pair of otoliths.
I can see it.
So one of them is still in this skull.
I see.
Yeah.
This one, I see 2
Mhm.
of that.
So
Yeah.
when you get to the beach and you find one of them, is it a possibility you could find a match with
Yeah, you can.
both?
Yeah, these skulls actually are probably the most likely to be found on the beach, the catfish skulls. And often they do still have those otoliths in them, and you could pull the otoliths out. So this is one where you might actually find a skull and, you know, and find the otoliths in the skull. They're not fossilized. These came from catfish that died, you know, recently. And when I say recently, I mean it could have been a year ago or 2 years ago, but not thousands of years ago. They're not fossilized.
Oh, like a decade, but not.
Yeah, so you could find the fossilized otoliths out on that beach, and you might also be able to find these skulls. Sometimes you might find a fish carcass, and if you're into this kind of thing, I'll give you a tip. You could take a carcass, and if it still has flesh on it that you want, you know, to be removed. Since you guys are local, you might not want to put that in your luggage and carry it too far with you, but you could take that and you could put it on an ant mound. And the ants will pick the flesh off, and then, you know, you might, yeah, and so that's one way that you could deflesh a carcass if you found say, for example, a catfish carcass on the beach and it still had some stuff on it that you didn't want on it. And then you could have that skull, and if you wanted to, you could remove the otoliths.
This one has pretty big ones.
Yeah, that's a catfish, and catfish kind of live on the bottom.
It is big.
Uh-huh. And so they have pretty big otoliths for their size.
Is this a catfish?
Uh-huh. That's a catfish skull. So, do you guys have any other questions? You're welcome to look at any of these things here.
I got a question.
I just think it's so cool that we're touching part of something that lived that
Uh-huh.
long.
Yeah.
With the.
Uh-huh. And so if you were so inclined, to go out beach combing on Dolphin Island, and you found otoliths kind of in this stretch of East End Beach between the East End and the Audubon Bird Sanctuary. There are a lot of otoliths out there. And so if you were inclined to go out there and look for fossil otoliths and fossil shark teeth too, and you wanted to contribute that to science, if you wanted to be a citizen scientist, you could either take a photo of them and send them to June Ebersole at McWayne Science Center, or you could, you know, mail them
So
to
you
them.
can find one of these and then go drive up all the way to Birmingham.
Well, you could, or you could just take a picture and send it to him, or mail him. We mail him otoliths periodically.
How rare is it to have a crack on the bone when you find it?
It just kind of depends on what that skull has gone through. Sometimes they're in pretty intact condition, and sometimes they've been broken. Just
One time
kind
I was at the beach, I
depending.
found this fossilized fish. It was like around for a few days, but it still had some flesh on it.
of. Well, if you were a collector and you wanted to collect something like that, and you wanted to get the flesh off of it, you could put it on an ant mound for a little bit, and they'd help you clean that up.
So you can grab it once.
There are other ways you could do it too, but that's probably the easiest if you live near a fire ant mound, as so many of us do down here.
We do. This is a big fish. I can
That
see
was
the-
a big
I can
fish.
see,
Yeah.
it's a big one. I can see it.
So, thank you for joining us for today's Boardwalk Talk, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Bye.
Uh-huh.